Hi, I'm Derek Holota.
And I'm Harry Burns.
And this is Building in Common, stories from the tech revolution and the people making it happen.
So Derek, it's been a very busy week in AI land. For those that haven't seen, there was a global AI summit taking place in India with tons of stories coming out of it. Can you give a little sort of highlight of some of the stories that caught your eye?
Yeah, well, I mean, the AI summit in India just kind of shows if you want somebody to show up and just hand over billions and billions, you just need to throw them a bit of a party. I mean, the list of investments announced at this summit, like, it's kind of eye-watering. We got 50 billion from Microsoft, 100 billion from Adani, 110 billion from Reliance Industries in Geo, both Indian-based companies. OpenAI signed on as Tata's first data center customer, and NVIDIA announced a deal with Larsen and Toubro on infrastructure. So, like, the summit is just swimming in money. I mean, it's a great way to make headlines. To be honest, aside from all the investments being announced, I don't know what else is coming out of the summit aside from reports of just poor event planning, but that's a whole other story.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a sign of things to come this year. I think I'm right in saying that analysts suggest that over $700 billion is due to be invested in AI this year, setting up, all of these companies for, these mega investments. I think were described by Anthropic CEO Modi. I think I'm pronouncing that right.
Modi,
as YOLOing trillions of dollars into compute infrastructure. And I think that's sort of, that's where we are. We are in this crazy new world where up to sort of trillions of dollars are being invested, and these companies are now so in debt that they have to, they can't miss any of their targets by even 1%, or else they're going to be, in deep trouble, which causes all sorts of issues, both for these companies, but also for society, in that, these CEOs who have huge power already, it's, they are incentivized. Not only are they incentivized, but it's, their whole survival depends upon no slowdown in AI and in AI adoption, which means that they're going to put huge amounts of pressure on politicians and on governments not to put on the brakes at all. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I mean, I think regulation of AI is kind of the thing that we're just really falling behind on, isn't it? I mean, the AI wars are continuing at pace. They're not going to slow down, and by and large, governments have done little to nothing to regulate this technology. I mean, Donald Trump has said there will be no regulation in the US. The UK has taken a bit more of a hands-on approach, although, I mean, debatable how much they've actually achieved. I mean, when it comes down to it, like, to regulate this, we need people who understand the technology to be in positions to regulate it. And I don't, at the risk of sounding cynical, I don't know that we can confidently say that our current politicians fall into that category.
No, I mean, having spent years working in politics, politicians weren't always the most tech savvy of any group of people that I've ever worked with. Oftentimes because lots of them don't come from industry, they don't come from sort of cutting edge technological backgrounds, so they spend a lot of their time in trade unions, particularly from the Labour Party, where tech isn't always at the forefront of thinking. I mean, when I worked for the party for years, it was quite a sort of a well-known secret that one of the most senior officials in the party didn't know how to use a computer. And this was back in the sort of the mid 2010s. So we're not talking 30 or 40 years ago. We're talking just a short amount of time ago. And these are the people that are supposed to be setting policy when it comes to regulating tech. So I think it's there's a long way to go. And as you said, there's a massive knowledge gap, which allows for these tech CEOs to take advantage of regulators. But also, I think that there's a sort of deification of these figures who are often, there's loads of hagiographies and books written about, all their amazing rise and their huge sort of, cutting edge contribution to society, which, I mean, I think it leads to politicians being a little bit starstruck when they're in the room with them. I think we saw that early days in Facebook when Mark Zuckerberg gave evidence before Congress. Loads of congressmen just seemed pleased to have him in the room, rather than asking the tough questions and holding him to account for for the technology which was going to shape not just our social lives and our online lives, but the very real sort of political implications that these technologies have on our society.
Yeah, it's just like the political animal comes out and they see a great photo op instead of actually thinking about doing the policymaking process.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Potentially like a missed opportunity, isn't it? I mean, London is home to some of the world's great AI talent. It's long been sort of a global center for AI talent. DeepMind was founded here, which obviously is now part of Google and is the driving force behind Gemini. And you've got OpenAI, who ever since ChatGPT came out, they have consistently been increasing their investment in the UK. So we have the knowledge in the country, albeit not in governments. Like what does government have to do to close that gap and make sure that like the UK doesn't sort of miss this opportunity to be a leader on smart regulation?
Yeah, I think the tech companies are part of a larger problem in that where, in terms of sort of the educational piece, obviously the UK is very strong on that with our sort of, our amazing world-class universities. But then when it comes to taking the steps after university in terms of building companies and scaling and getting investment, oftentimes people will move to the US. And I think that's a larger economic problem in the country, in that we are not seen as a sort of fertile environment for VC and venture capital. I think, I'm right in saying that companies will often get much higher valuations in the US than they would in the UK. And so I think that attracts companies to, who are UK based, to then think about sort of upping sticks and leaving to go to the US. I think lots of these companies would probably choose to stay in the UK if they could, but I think they think that, in terms of scaling faster and attracting the investment that's gonna see the returns that they want to see, they think the US is the right home for them. But I think I think UK politicians have a big role to play in creating that sort of entrepreneurial spirit in our country, which we just don't really have in the same way in the US. I don't think from an early age people are being taught that that they can start their own companies. They should be thinking about that as a career option. Oftentimes we're very safe in how we guide people at school. We haven't built up that sort of the mythology around the founder in the same way that they have in the US. And I think that you see this across Europe as well. I think lots of people from other sort of Central European countries only see the US as as the place that's going to really allow them to flourish in terms of allowing their their entrepreneurship journey to reach where they want to reach, because of perhaps it's a lack of ambition, or perhaps it's more of a sort of collective approach to society. Whereas in the US, obviously, it's much more about individuals and putting them up on pedestals and saying it's down to one individual who have managed to build this company. Whereas in the UK, and particularly in Northern Europe, it's much more about the collective and it's much more about society, which means that those people with that real individual drive, the drive to sort of put themselves front and center and be the figurehead of a corporation, they will often then think only the US is the right home for them.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think the US has always had a really strong brand around being a place for entrepreneurs to succeed. But I mean, again, I guess at the risk of being cynical, like for the next few years while President Trump is in office, if you are a member of the AI community, whether you're on the technical side or the commercial side, and you're looking at setting up a business or joining an upstart, I feel like over the next few years, the US is not going to necessarily be at the top of your list, especially if you are part of a minority. So is this an opportunity for, let's say, the middle power governments like the UK, like Canada, like Australia, to like invest in standing this culture up within their own countries? And if it is that opportunity, how do they do it? Because the UK government so far has not done that.
Yeah, no, I think you're completely right, and I think also not only is it that we have maybe a more favorable sort of political environment when it comes to our leadership, but also because we aren't dependent upon sort of a small group of AI companies for our sort of our financial security in the UK. In the same way, in the US, obviously there's a small group of companies that are very dominant on the NASDAQ. and they pour huge amounts of money into US politics. We are slightly immune from that. We are tightening up our regulations about foreign donors into UK politics. No longer can you donate to a UK political party through a company, through a foreign company, in a way to sort of create interference and back a particular political party in the UK. So we are sort of immune to some degree from that. But obviously, these big companies are, as we were saying before, they've got a lot to lose from any sort of regulation. And one piece of regulation in the UK or in the EU can start a sort of a chain reaction, as we've seen in Australia with the banning of social media use for under 16s. I think that there's huge lobbying efforts going on behind the scenes to make sure that those sorts of bans don't spread. So clearly these companies are going to do all they can to shape policy in the UK and in Europe. But like you said, what we've seen with Mark Carney during the Munich Security Conference and during the World Economic Forum, he's showing great leadership in trying to bring together all of the, shall we say, more reasonable powers to address the big issues that that cross borders that can no longer be dealt with by countries on an individual basis. So I think that there really is a massive opportunity to present these countries as a sort of the reasonable, moderate voice on AI, where they don't want to put a halt on it completely, but absolutely there should be some guardrails. Because as you said before, the fact that the US administration is forcing US states not to do any of their own independent regulation of AI. So not even Republican states are allowed to do any, think about any curtailing of AI's power. And I think that is actually causing a bit of a fissure in the Republican base, in that you've got conservative Christian Republicans who don't want these giant tech companies to have complete supreme power where they allow anything to go out to anyone. Obviously there's the family values, traditional base of the conservative movement in the US who want regulation of AI and of online spaces because they are concerned about the type of messages that people are seeing. And so I think that fracture is probably only going to grow in the US as we have the sort of, the business elites being divided from the traditional Republican base, which can lead to quite an unstable, I think, environment to do business. Whereas in the UK and in Europe, I think there's a much more sensible, reasonable conversation that's going on about how we can get maximum benefit from AI and how we can use it to, unlock huge improvements in healthcare and in education. Rishi Sunak, the former Prime Minister of the UK, was over in India. He is now an advisor to Microsoft and I think to Anthropic. And he's pushing how AI can help to level the playing field when it comes to education in Africa, and how more people, you don't have to have a smartphone necessarily to get the benefits of AI when it comes to education and also to healthcare, particularly with maternal health. I think former Prime Minister Sunak is really pushing how AI can be used to help people in places where there's not great health coverage. And so obviously there's huge benefits to be gained, but we can't just allow regulation and policy to be set by the people who ultimately are incentivized to just keep growth going as fast as possible and stopping anybody from trying to get in their way.
One of the things that's really stood out to me as a Canadian in the UK is over the last sort of 12 to 18 months, there's been a lot of ink spilled, especially within the business media, about the number of millionaires who have left the UK in that time. And typically it's framed as a bad sign for the UK economy. And if the millionaire who has left gives an interview, they invariably blame the Labour governments and the regulations around business for why they decided to leave the country. How much of an impact do you think that is making in, let's say, the Prime Minister's office when they are thinking about policy making? Like, is this something that they're worried about, or is it just sort of noise on the outside? Because I wonder if because we've had that for sort of the last 12 to 18 months, if that is part of perhaps the slow movement on regulating AI.
So it's a difficult one, and I'm probably going to let my political colours show here. In that, there's a small group of, as you said, a small group of very loud voices who love to post from Dubai. that that because the UK is no longer welcoming to millionaires and billionaires, that they've decided to do the patriotic thing and to take their tax pounds and move it to the Middle East. I think that oftentimes the story is not the reality, in that people will say that they're in the Middle East, they will say that they're based in Dubai, but they will still live the majority of their life in London. And I think this was always the case that was made by Labour politicians in the past, about taxes on the super wealthy, is that people might say they want to move to Switzerland or move to Dubai, but in reality, London is, in my view, one of the greatest cities in the world. And so will people actually leave because of the sort of marginal increase in their tax rate? Will they actually shift their money and go and move elsewhere? I think that the reality is probably not what it might seem from looking at LinkedIn. I think oftentimes people want to tell a story, but in terms of what their actions actually reveal, is that maybe there isn't a massive movement of the wealthy abroad. But obviously it is a concern, because perception oftentimes is reality, and so so for politicians, they are going to be concerned that that the UK is no longer seen as a sort of pro-business, pro-investment environment. But I think just today it was announced that the UK has the largest surplus in government spending of any month. I think I'm right in saying in the last 50 years, which shows that the economy is to some degree getting back on track, and a lot of that is from tax take. So obviously, it's not having the impact that these uber wealthy people are suggesting it might have, in that the UK still seems to be on a slightly better trajectory than it has been in the last 10 years or so.
The reason why we call this podcast Building in Common, obviously, is because you and I are both starting businesses. Has it ever occurred to you that you shouldn't set it up in the UK? Have you ever thought about maybe the UK is not the right place to do it? I mean, I certainly haven't, despite reading all of the naysayers in the media. But what do you think?
I mean, again, I'm gonna show my political colours. I think that taxes are the price we pay to live in a civilized society, and I quite enjoy contributing to the country that that I'm from and where I'm raising my family. And so I think that things would have to change dramatically for me to consider moving a business abroad simply for taxation reasons. I don't think we're there yet, and I don't think we are going there. I don't think this incarnation of the Labour government it's not the Labour Party of the 80s or the 70s. They don't want to impose huge taxes on the ultra wealthy. To quote Peter Mandelson, who is no longer a particularly credible voice, but during Blair years, the message was that we are entirely comfortable with people getting very wealthy. And I think this Labour Party remains entirely comfortable with people becoming very wealthy. I think they're just asking them to share the burden slightly more than perhaps the Conservative government would. But though the Conservative government had the highest tax burden of any government in modern times, and so I'm not sure there's a huge difference between the two parties when it comes to taxation at the moment, especially when the economy is where it is and with the global pressures that we all face.
All right, switching gears to communication. I mean, the impact of AI on corporate communication and marketing communications is well debated, well documented. We see it every day. Political communication is a different animal. So obviously you've worked on a whole bunch of elections. Talk a bit about where you see AI fitted into the way elections are run and the way campaigns are run.
I think with as with any sort of technological improvement, we're going to see the knock-on effects in political campaigns. So when I was younger, when I was starting out in Labour Party politics, the direct mail was still king. And for those that don't know, direct mail is basically just an address letter to voters. The Labour Party came up with this ingenious tool called Mailmaker, which allowed you to merge in. So you added different bits of content to different letters depending on certain criteria. So that's called micro-targeting. So depending on whether somebody was likely to have a family, whether somebody was likely to live in a certain postcode, we would drag in certain paragraphs into that direct mail to try and appeal to that particular voter's interests. And then obviously with the advent of digital campaigning, micro targeting became a much more sophisticated art, and it allowed you to divide the electorate up into smaller and smaller segments, as we used to call it. But I think that even before AI, that was changing slightly in that, people, because of what happened in previous presidential elections with Cambridge Analytica and the use of large-scale Facebook data to target voters, I think people became increasingly skeptical of political advertising online. They became disbelieving of the content, and also maybe not even believing that the video that they're seeing is entirely real. And that was even before AI has started to sort of flood all of our social media channels with the AI slop that we see today. So I think one of the negative effects is going to be the continuation of that sort of disbelievingness of the things that you're seeing. So I think that there will be a role for AI when it comes to creating content for future campaigns. I think it's just a matter of time before we see candidates using AI more and more in political advertising to cast forward an eye to show what the world would look like under a different regime, whether it's for positive or for negative. That was used in the past, I think, for the Brexit campaign to show what the country would be like under, if Britain were to leave the European Union. I think in the 24 general election campaign, there was to some degree the use of AI in campaign collateral. So there were lots of questions about whether Reform's photographs on their campaign leaflets were AI generated. A lot of the candidates looked perhaps quite robotic, which isn't always impossible for a political candidate to look robotic. But the pictures looked very much airbrushed. If not entirely generated by AI. And so, so I think we've started to see that already. And there was, this got a bit of coverage at the time, but there was Britain's first ever AI candidate stood for election in Brighton. What that meant was it was a human who registered to stand for election, but the entire campaign was delivered by his AI avatar. He only got 179 votes. But I think that this is going to be the start of a trend. I don't think we're going to see more AI candidates necessarily, and I don't think we're going to see any AI candidates being successful. But I think we are going to see AI shaping how political parties both generate content, but also how they start to model what voters think. Obviously, polling has always been a massive part of election campaigns. And polling models have been a big part. So what a polling model is rather than trying to speak to a statistically significant proportion of the electorate, you will speak to a small segment, but you'll try and sort of cross all of the key demographic groups, and then you use that model to extrapolate out to see what different groups are thinking about what political parties or what political issues. Obviously, with AI, you now have the capability to run sort of endless simulations, endless discussions with AI versions of these voters to start to see what content and what messages resonate with them, how you can change their opinion. But also I think it's when it comes to a party's election manifesto, election manifestos aren't always the most readable document. But I think in the future, if I was advising a political party, I would certainly be thinking about how can you create a LLM that's completely trained on your manifesto, so that any voter thinking about who to vote for can go on there and say, oh, hi, I'm Harry Burns. I live in this particular postcode. I have 2 kids. What are you going to do for me? I think that is just a matter of time before the next, possibly at the next election, that these AI manifestos and these AI LLMs will start to shape how people vote. But then you clearly also have the more nefarious part of it, where you can deploy AI to slander other people, to deep fakes, suggesting that a candidate has said something that they haven't done. This happened a couple of times in the last election. There was a deep fake audio of apparently of Keir Starmer berating his staff, which sort of cut into the perception that he was a nice guy that was going to run a sort of serious government, rather than the juxtaposed with the Conservatives who were seen as chaotic. This fake audio was trying to sort of trying to hit at that message that Starmer was going to be a sort of serious, grown up, sensible prime minister. And it spread like wildfire. And it got a lot of attention, and it obviously led to Labour coming out and saying it wasn't real. But I think that's perhaps just a sign of things to come. But then when it comes to sort of the sort of second order effects of AI and this increasing mistrust in information that we see online, I think it's going to see a reversion back to the things that I remember being really important when I was running my first election campaigns. So perhaps back to print media, perhaps back to direct mailings, but definitely back to more in-person, one-to-one events, and also how you can encourage people, your supporters, to contact their friends and family in sort of I was seeing this described as sort of pods of trust. So it's like, you might not trust what you see online, you might not trust what you see on LLMs, but you do trust your nan on the WhatsApp chat, who's giving you her view about who to vote for and who would be the best choice for the country and election. So I think getting back down to the sort of the in-person contact, but also the one-to-one engagement between peer-to-peer campaigning, that's going to encourage people to vote a certain way, because someone that they trust and someone that they know is real is giving them a message that they believe is worthy of listening to, because it's coming from a sort of trusted source.
I think this is probably like the best example we could use for why smart AI regulation is so important. I mean, all the things that you just listed in terms of the nefarious side of what you can use AI for in a campaign. I mean, 10 years ago, we saw what a whole bunch of Russian bots could do using Twitter to get a preferred candidate elected in the United States. I mean, imagine what happens when they start going into an LLM where people are getting their news from. It is worrying. It is worrying, right? Like I do sometimes, like I sit and I think about it and I'm like, am I becoming a conspiracy theorist? Am I thinking like too dystopian about this stuff?
Yeah.
But it feels like we are now kind of at this like crossroads where it's not actually that hard to imagine going down a road where our democracies become really seriously threatened by even more intense misinformation, and just driving people into more segmented echo chambers than they currently are. That's the cynical side. But I think without some sort of smart regulation around this, it's not that hard to get there. And so that's what keeps me up at night, Harry. And now I've just depressed both of us.
Well, look, I think to try and end on a positive note, Derek, to play into type of being the positive one on the podcast, yeah. I think it's obviously it's right to be concerned, and absolutely governments around the world have to unite to act on this, or else we will be in a situation where these LLMs are deciding things that they absolutely shouldn't be deciding. But I do also think that when it comes to previous elections and the use of sort of bots and trolls and even the Cambridge Analytica example that I cited earlier, I think that these things are important, but they didn't actually decide an election outcome. They had a teeny tiny role to play, but when it comes to the influencing ultimately, I can't remember in that election, but it was like 25,000 votes or something like that decided who was going to be president. And the idea that a troll farm, a Russian troll farm, is going to influence those 25,000 voters, especially when a lot of them weren't on Twitter, and lots of them weren't even on Facebook. It's like, so you should be worried about it, but you shouldn't, I think, over focus on the actual the direct implications of these particular actions. I think the broader question, as you were saying before, is about echo chambers and about the general sources of truth in general. And when you can't trust, when you feel like you can't trust anything that you see anymore, then that starts to chip away at institutions. So I don't think my fear is not, well, back to the negative. My fear is not that it's going to persuade people to vote for a particular party or not. It's that it's going to damage our very trust in the institutions that make our countries what they are. And that has a very potentially negative impact on future generations where they grow up without any trust in our government or nation states or democracy itself. There we go. Ending on a high, Derek. Ending on a high. I'm sure everyone's going to want to tune in next week for doomsday scenario number 4.
We're gonna have to have a more lighthearted topic next week, so we don't all just go into a dark corner and wait for the apocalypse. Harry, good analysis as always. I'm sure we'll talk about this again because it's going to come, right? At some point, the government's going to have to start to regulate AI, and it's going to have a whole bunch of knock-on effects on businesses and society. And so we can't help but talk about it. So until then, see you then.